From Indy's streaming news leader, this is a WRTV breaking news update.
And we are joining you in the middle of programming to bring to you the verdict in the Delphi double murder case, the murders of Abby Williams and Libby German. The jury in Delphi has just delivered their verdict. It was read to the court, and we do want to pass that along to you, what we've learned in just the last couple of moments here. Richard Allen, the prime suspect in this case, has been found guilty on all counts. Richard Allen has been found guilty of the murder of Libby German, guilty of murder while kidnapping of Libby German. He's been found guilty for the murder of Abigail Williams, and the jury also returned a guilty verdict in the charge of murder while kidnapping of Abigail Williams. The jury has spent what is much over the last 4 days, with a break from Sunday, talking about the evidence in this case, poring over all the details that were presented to them by the prosecution and the defense in this, and finally within the last hour returned that guilty verdict, guilty on all charges for Richard Allen. We do have an expert with us here in studio to give us some perspective about what this means, what the jury went through over the last several days, and what this means for the case moving forward. So with me now is Courtney Benson-Coy, a criminal justice attorney. Thanks for being here with us. So guilty on all counts for Richard Allen. As you followed this case, was this a surprise to you, and why or why not?
I am surprised, actually. From what I was hearing, did not think that there was enough evidence to get beyond a reasonable doubt. But the jury, did their job. They deliberated for a long time. We don't know exactly what went on in that courtroom. So I am surprised, but I stand by the jury's verdict. The
prosecution laid out a lot of what was called circumstantial evidence, and what was missing there was the DNA evidence, which has become so key in high-profile and murder cases like this. And so that circumstantial evidence that was laid out, you feel like, in your expert opinion, maybe not have been enough for a conviction?
And again, I'm just going by what I've seen and heard. What actually happens in the courtroom is a lot different than what we see and hear out in the public. So,
as you watch the case, what stuck out to you as far as this has to be a questionable, reasonable doubt?
Yeah, I didn't see a lot of direct evidence pointing directly to Richard Allen. I did not see any witness come and say this. I saw Richard Allen there in that area at that time. The forensics I'm a little skeptical of. But those are the things that kind of stuck out to me.
Okay. Well, we're going to keep you here for a little bit as we go back and forth, and we're going to catch up with our Caitlin Kendall, who is live in Delphi, has been covering this case very closely, not just the trial, but the case itself, as they searched for a suspect in this case, as police announced they made an arrest, and now following every step of the way, listening to all the testimony, and waiting as the jury poured over all this evidence. Caitlin, tell us what you're hearing there and what you've learned here in the last couple of hours.
Mark, after about 19 hours of deliberating for the jury, they found Richard Allen guilty on all 4 charges in the murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German. More than 7.5 years of waiting for the family of Abby and Libby. And I can tell you, when the verdict was read, everyone was crying, both Richard Allen's family and Abby and Libby's family. Many members of Libby's family kind of saying yes when that first count of guilty verdict was read. Those 4 charges: count 1, felony murder, found guilty on all 4 counts. Count 1, felony murder for the death of Abigail Williams. Count 2, felony murder for the death of Liberty German. Count 3, for the killing of Abigail Williams. And count 4, for the killing of Liberty German. Something the family has been waiting for 7.5 years to hear. When the verdict was read, the family, as I just mentioned, started crying, started hugging each other. And just as the family was about to leave, after the jury read their verdict, it only took a couple of minutes for that to be read. Many of the family members were hugging investigators. Investigators were crying, the prosecution team was crying, but they also were smiling. These were obvious happy tears. It's a lot. It's a lot for this family to be dealing with for all of this time, waiting 19 hours or so to hear that verdict. And after the verdict was read, the defense team actually asked for a roll call from every single one of the jury members to confirm that it was their belief that Richard Allen was to be found guilty on all 4 charges. The entire 12-person jury answered the judge saying yes, that was their verdict. Now, when it was read, Richard Allen's family, they were seen crying. Richard Allen's wife could not get up. She sat in her chair. She couldn't get up. Richard Allen's mother also struggling to stand up, having to be held up by family members, and even parts of the defense team were wrapping their arms around the Allen family. As for Richard Allen himself, he was sitting down, showed no emotion when that verdict was read, emotionless the entire time as all 4 counts were read in this case against him. Now, prosecutor Nicholas McLeland laid out a timeline from February 13th of 2017, and in that timeline, the prosecutor told the jury that Richard Allen put himself on the trail that day. They said that Richard Allen, when he was confessing more than 60 times, had information that only the killer would know. And they said in those confessions, Richard Allen was detailing what happened in this crime. And there also was that bullet found at the crime scene. The jury ultimately siding with the prosecution. The expert witness for the prosecution saying that the bullet found at the crime scene between Abby and Libby's bodies had been cycled through Richard Allen's gun. The defense said it was an untrusted science, but of course the jury deciding that it should be trusted, and I'm sure that's one of the pieces of evidence the jury considered. A number of phone call interviews, a number of video of Richard Allen inside of his cell that the defense said he was mentally unwell. The jury deciding otherwise. Again, the family escorted out together, but all of the family just kind of holding each other today. And it's a bit of a celebration for those family members of Abby and Libby. And of course, very hard for Richard Allen's family to understand that Richard Allen is going to be sentenced and found guilty on all 4 charges. His sentencing is set for December, later in December, where he will be sentenced on all 4 of those charges. But again, Richard Allen has been found guilty on all 4 counts in the murders of Abby Williams and Libby German. Mark.
Caitlin, you had a chance to be in the courtroom as this verdict was being read, and you said that you watched Richard Allen as well. What happened with Richard Allen after these verdicts were read, and what was his demeanor again? Tell us what happened to him and where he was taken.
His demeanor, Mark, has kind of been the same throughout this entire trial. He hasn't really shown any emotion. He's been kind of expressionless, if you will. When the verdict was being read, it was much of the same. He sat there with his defense attorney, Andrew Baldwin, was rubbing the back of his head and was patting him on the back. But Richard Allen showed no emotion himself. And so it's kind of what we've seen come from Richard Allen throughout this entire trial. After that happened, Richard Allen was then handcuffed and escorted out of the courtroom as his family watched that happen and as Abby and Libby's family watched that happen.
And Caitlin, I know on Friday many people had signs both in support of Richard Allen, support for the families of Abby and Libby. What's been the reaction? I know you've just stepped outside, but just from the people around the courthouse there you posted there was a long line of people just today again.
Yeah, there was 100 people or so wanting an opportunity to head inside of the courthouse. I was one of the lucky ones who got a chance to step inside, but stepping out, it's a lot of emotions. A lot of people from Richard Allen's arrest believe that police had the wrong guy. Ultimately, the jury deciding that was not the case. But many people thought that there was just circumstantial evidence. It wasn't enough to convict Richard Allen, but the jury thought otherwise. Despite circumstantial evidence or not, the jury thought that the prosecution had enough to convict Richard Allen.
Caitlin, do you know if the families will be speaking at all to the media today?
We do not know. I had an opportunity to just sort of hug the family of Abby and Libby both when they were heading out of the courtroom, and they're crying happy tears. I think it's a lot of emotions for either side to grapple with, whether it's Richard Allen's family, who now knows he's going to be convicted for up to 130 years, or Abby and Libby's family that can kind of start this next path in this journey of healing. So we do not know if the family's going to speak, but of course, if they do, we'll make sure that we bring it to you guys.
All right, our Caitlin Kendall Live will be checking in with you stay close and as we get updates here. I do want to return to our guest here, Courtney. If we can go back over these charges the jury had to consider. And some of our viewers have been questioning what was the difference between the murder of each girl and then murder while kidnapping of each girl. What is the distinction there, and why was that so important and a tool for prosecutors to use?
So the difference is that the murder counts is a knowing and intentional killing. Felony murder is just that a death happened in the commission of a felony, so that there was a kidnapping and a death happened in commission of that felony. But because he's been found guilty of all 4 counts, those felony counts will probably merge with the murder counts.
And I know we talked about those confession tapes, hearing him, the jury, how much do you really think that weighed on their decision, actually hearing it in his words that he did it?
I'm sure it weighed heavily on their decision, and given the amount of times, as well as hearing it in his own voice, I'm sure that weighed heavily in their decision.
What comes next in a case like this? We know sentencing, but of course we're probably expecting them to appeal as well.
Correct. So once Mr. Allen is sentenced, he will then get his appellate rights read to him by the judge, and he will likely have indigent counsel appointed if he can't afford an attorney to represent him. He has that absolute right to appeal.
Courtney, you were saying that you have tried so many cases where you've watched the timeline of that a jury takes. Accordion, sometimes it's a very quick conviction, and sometimes it takes days, if not weeks, to pore over all the evidence they have to consider. What are some of the processes that these jurors go through? Is it they have to convince each other sometimes to reach unanimous decisions?
Yeah, they have to work together while not giving up their own, personally held beliefs. So they have to work together, and with all of this evidence, they've been pouring through a lot of evidence. It took, 17 days to try. So that's a lot of evidence for them to go through, and it feels like they took their job very seriously here.
What was your first reaction when you heard guilty?
My first reaction, I was a little shocked. If I'm being honest, I definitely thought that the case was circumstantial, and but again, I wasn't in the courtroom, and there are so many things that happen in the courtroom that we don't get to know about.
When our viewers hear guilty and they're hearing about this case, is there anything that's standing out to you that you think is important to include or touch on as we finally get to this verdict today?
Just that it's a rough day for. It can be a good day for the families, but also a rough day for the families. This is the really hard part. There really are no winners when it comes to a case like this. There's devastation on both sides.
Devastation, yeah.
In a case like this, where it had been brought up that there was possibly others involved, or there may have been other parties, a conviction like this ends that investigation, correct?
Yes, and it's my understanding that the investigation, at least from the Carroll County, ended with when they arrested Richard Allen.
Next is sentencing. That will be up to the judge to lay out those parameters, or is this the state have this jurisdiction and lays it out automatically in a case like this?
Yeah, so the judge is going to have the ultimate decision on what sentence Mr. Allen gets. He is facing 45 to 65 on each count. So.
Courtney, as you look at this case, and many high-profile cases that go years without having any kind of resolution, end up being one for the history books. What do you think the law world of the future will take from this case, looking back as an historic case?
I think they'll look at the investigation and kind of the missteps of that investigation, and had the investigation gone more smoothly, this might not have been such a high-profile,
which was a key argument
case
in the defense's case.
Yeah.
So they'll look back at the criminal investigation into it?
I think so.
When you think about the family waiting 7.5 years for justice, how does the town move on from something like this when a day like today they're finally getting to this point? The significance of finally getting someone saying this is who did it.
Yeah, I think that it's going to be hard to move on from something like this. I think the town is relieved, from what I've heard, that this trial would be over, whatever the verdict was. But I do believe this has garnered a lot of attention, national attention as well. And so I don't know that this will necessarily be the ending that they're hoping for.
As a defense attorney yourself, following this case, what big takeaways did you have when listening to some of the evidence and some of the argument from the defense?
Yeah, I mean, I agreed with the defense, and that could be just a product of I am a defense attorney. So I do believe that the evidence was circumstantial, but like I said, I wasn't in that courtroom, and I accept the jury's verdict. I don't know exactly what they heard, but something that they heard in there convinced them beyond a reasonable doubt to find him guilty.
And Courtney, I know we were talking when you were here last week about the impact of being in solitary confinement can have on an inmate. Can you touch on that a little bit more?
Yeah. Really, solitary confinement is not meant for extended periods of time. 13 months is a long time for anyone to be in solitary confinement. I do believe that probably led to some of the confessions. Not making a judgment on whether those were true or false. Just I do believe that being in that confinement can make people very desperate.
If you're just joining us here, we do want to recap what is happening. We do have a verdict in the Delphi double murder case with prime suspect Richard Allen. He was found guilty on all 4 counts that were up against him. If we can put up that graphic listing the charges there, we can go over what the jury decided today. The jury did come back with a guilty verdict in the murder of Libby German. They also came back with a guilty verdict in the charge of murder while kidnapping Libby German. And they also came back with a guilty verdict in the murder of Abigail Williams and murder while kidnapping of Abigail Williams. Again, guilty on all charges. This is a day of justice for the 2 girls, Abby Williams and Libby German. We never wanted to forget their names in this, and the young lives that were taken away so early in this. Both had such great dreams and were best of friends. And so for their families, this is a day of justice. We heard Caitlin say how emotional everyone was inside the courtroom when those verdicts were read earlier.
Yeah, Richard Allen is a suspect that was arrested in 2022, so 5 years or so after. And when you think about how long the jury deliberated, it was Saturday, it was all day Friday, and continued today. What does that tell you from your point of view on, they had a ton of evidence to go through?
Yeah, it tells me that they took their job seriously, that they went through the evidence, that they didn't just go in there and come to a snap judgment. So.
And that's a lot of evidence to go through. We know on Saturday they actually asked to come back into the courthouse to review that. Is that common for a jury to be able to do?
Yes, the jury is allowed to review the evidence. Most of the time, the audio and visual evidence will be reviewed inside the courtroom. They get to take a lot of the paper evidence back with them.
And you talked about that jury being sequestered and the role that this played. We were kind of surprised last Thursday when they decided to go home pretty early. But can you talk a little bit about the impact that has on a jury being sequestered during this time away from their families?
I mean, essentially they have, not that they don't have anything else to do, but their sole focus is on this case, and you don't get that a lot. And so they put a lot of work and effort into this, and this is what they took home with them every day. So.
And I know our Caitlin Kendall has been on this case since the very beginning.
Right, she's been covering this since before the trial started.
Yeah.
Has developed a rapport with the families on both sides, the prosecution and the defense here, the families of Libby and Abby, and also Richard Allen's family. Caitlin, you've had a chance to really talk personally with each of those that are involved, and this is not an easy day for anyone.
Yeah, actually, Mark and Nicole, the judge said before we started going, someone is going to be unhappy with the verdict. And that is absolutely the case. When you have 2 families involved here, really 3 families, Abby and Libby's family involved and Richard Allen's family involved, someone is bound to be unhappy with this. I can tell you that if you'll remember, Special Judge Fran Gohl placed a gag order on this case, meaning anyone involved in this case was not allowed to talk. We were just informed by Indiana State Police the gag order is still in effect. It'll be in effect until at least December 20th when Richard Allen is sentenced. Now, he could be sentenced to up to 130 years for these 4 murder charges. Again, if you are just now tuning in, found guilty on all 4 charges here. The first 2 on the felony counts and the second 2 on the murders of Abby and Libby. But I did have an opportunity, Mark, you mentioned it, talking with the families extensively throughout the trial and before the trial. And I'll never forget Kathy Allen. The first time I saw her was the very first court appearance after Richard Allen was arrested. And I told her to hang in there. And she looked at me and she said, he's my person. I don't know how I'm supposed to forget that. And she kind of has been there every step of the way. She's been by his side. And when the verdict was read, Kathy Allen was crying. She had to actually be assisted up by people. She was unable to even stand on her own. And the same for his mother and for other members of the defense team really struggling. Richard Allen himself, though, was showing no emotion. When the verdict was read, he remained emotionless. His defense attorney, Andrew Baldwin, had his arm around him and was patting his back and rubbing the back of his head, but Richard Allen showed no emotion. On the other side, though, Abby and Libby's families, they were joyous, they were happy, they were crying, hugging one another, and being embraced by the prosecution and by many investigators. Superintendent Doug Carter, as many of you have seen, he's been really vocal before the arrest of Richard Allen, saying that they would find the person responsible. He was inside the courtroom with his wife, and he was emotional too. Jerry Holman, who was the lead investigator of this case, was also emotional. So everyone is super emotional, whether that's crying tears of sadness or happy tears, as the Abby and Libby family certainly are doing this evening.
Caitlin, earlier we saw, just before the verdict was announced, when we knew that there was a verdict, before it was announced though, you showed us on social media a large crowd outside of the courthouse. What is the mood and the atmosphere like there now? Have people just dispersed and cleared away from there?
No, Mark, there are dozens and dozens of people around the courthouse. Many media members, you can see, I mean, there's a gaggle of media members catching people of the public who have been waiting. And then there's people who are from Carroll County. There are people who are podcasters and YouTubers and all sorts of people who have been following this case from the beginning. And many of these people have been waiting outside of the Carroll County Courthouse overnight in lawn chairs to try to secure a seat to see this trial play out. And then, as I showed on social media, to see the verdict be read. And they're all still out here. They're all you know, just gathering content, if you will, and just talking amongst one another. But many people out here are even shocked. You know, I talked to some people who said they thought Richard Allen would be found not guilty. Of course, the jury ended up siding with a guilty verdict. So it's something that a lot of people are out here talking about it. We'll be out here to try to capture some people's emotions about the verdict being read. But unfortunately, we won't have the opportunity to hear from Abby and Libby's family or Richard Allen's family until that gag order is lifted.
Our Caitlin Kendall live in Delphi. Caitlin, I just want to say you've done a very nice job covering this case for us every step of the way. Thank you so much. And we just want to keep the girls in focus. 13 and 14 years old. They were best friends. Mark, last week I went through a ton of our archive footage of stories that we've done over the years so that we can really remember them tonight on our newscast. And they've created a memorial park in Delphi for the girls. They've held food drives. They've held motorcycle rides, all to keep these girls in the focus and help those families, let them know they're not alone during this.
And really in that, the spirit of the girls that we see in their photographs, that we've learned from their families, continues through all this goodwill, through all this philanthropy and work that we're seeing the community carry on their names with. So the girls together had that spirit that was just alive in their photographs, that the community carries that on to this day.
Abby loved to play volleyball, Libby softball, and I actually found out through our archive footage that Abby was going to play softball because she wanted to be closer to her best friend Libby. The girls love photography. Abby loved to do crafts. Libby loved to bake chocolate chip cookies for her family. So just a lot of memories, and we'll have that for you tonight coming on the news at 5 and 6.
Again, we want to recap the verdict that was just read by the jury in the Delphi double murder case, the case against Richard Allen. Richard Allen has been found guilty on all 4 charges that he faced. That includes the murder of Liberty German, the murder while kidnapping of Liberty German, the murder of Abigail Williams, and the murder while kidnapping Abigail Williams. And as you heard Caitlin report, Allen's sentencing will happen in December.
We are going to send you back to regular programming now, but join us at 5 and 6 tonight as we recap all of this. Thanks for being here with us.